Thank you and welcome back. We're continuing our series with the Royal Commission, and it's really great to have Dr. Peggy Brown and Professor Harry McConnell with us again. We've had some really interesting episodes so far, and I've really enjoyed the delve into the actual Royal Commission, the time it took Peggy and the other commissioners on the Royal Commission, and the findings and implementations that have come out of that. And I really would encourage you, if you're joining us for the second or the first time, to go back and look at those episodes and really see the depth of what Peggy's explained to us. Today's episode now is more about the implementation and the path forward, following on from the Royal Commission, where we can go, how the culture can change, what change was needed, and how far we've come, and what we still need to do.
So I think ongoing advocacy is really important. The Royal Commission made a whole raft of findings, made 122 recommendations, and workers commenced on implementing the vast majority of those. But action alone is not going to deliver the change. We need to make sure that real change occurs and that it's achieving the outcomes that we intended. And so, as with anything, over time, sometimes efforts can drop off. Sometimes if you're not watching and monitoring, things will revert back to the way they used to be. That's not specifically about defence or DVA in the veteran sector. I mean, that's kind of part of what we see in everyday life. So you need to have sustained effort and sustained attention to the issue. And this is where the role of the Australian people can come in, no matter who you are. I think in terms of continuing to be interested in what's happening and making sure that government understands this is important. This is important to the people of Australia, because if we take our eye off the ball, almost certainly other priorities will take precedence. So, my clear message to people is stay informed, stay involved, and keep speaking up in support of veterans and better outcomes for veterans. And I think in terms of it being non-political, I mean, obviously it rests with the government of the day. The government changed during the course of the Royal Commission. I think that we need the message to go to all politicians at a federal level, also at a state and territory level, and indeed even at a local level. There's things that can be happening to support veterans. And it really shouldn't be politicised. It really should be just stressing to everybody who has some level of input into government and governance that this is important and that you care.
There is a real gap in knowledge, I think, in many medical professionals about the specific plight of veterans and the nature of their mental health issues and the nature of the comorbidities associated with that. So there needs to be an upskilling, and that's the responsibility of both the clinicians but also the professional bodies. I think the Royal Colleges, medical schools, all need to really step up to the plate and really be offering specific training in veteran healthcare. I think that's very, very important and not really happening on a systemic level at all. And that also needs some specific instruction, not just on the difference in the conditions and how they present to veterans, but also in dealing with DVA, because as you mentioned before, some clinicians do have a bit of a phobia and won't see veterans because of the sort of fear of being overwhelmed with DVA paperwork. So that needs to somehow be reconciled, simplified, and clinicians and their staff need to be upskilled to deal with that, with the extra paperwork that does go along with that. And then when you have treatment programs, I think maybe many veterans really like treatment programs that are focused on their needs, that are focused on veterans. And they're not necessarily, particularly if it involves group therapies and sharing their stories, they're not really necessarily very comfortable with doing that in a group of civilians. So they're much more comfortable working with each other, working with their peers, and talking. Well, they'll talk more freely and get a lot more out of it if there's specific treatments that are made available for veterans.
Look, I think you can take it from, I guess, the very simple level to a more in depth. At the most basic level, it's just about letting those people who should know that you care, that this is an important issue. Politicians will attend to things that they know voters care about. So let your local member know, when there's an election coming up, doesn't matter whether it's a council election or a state government election or a federal election, go and talk to the candidates and ask them about what they're doing for veterans, what are their policies, etc. You can write to various people if you're so inclined, local members, ministers, senators, the Prime Minister. You could write to the Defence and Veterans Services Commissioner, presumably, can have input there. So anybody can have a voice in that way. I think in terms of, the professional bodies for those who are clinicians, letting the professional bodies know how much, you actually are interested and care about this, because they then liaise and negotiate with government around policy issues, around service, programs, around fee structures, that kind of thing. So I think there's a range of different ways in which people can let others know. Social media is obviously a great tool, but even just at the local level, just getting involved in things that might be happening. Now, it might be an event that's raising money for mental health or for veterans specifically. It might be a community group, a sporting group, and you might say, well, do we engage veterans in this? You can ask your local council, what do you offer for veterans and their families? Their families are really important, and we probably haven't talked a lot about families, but they are really important. That's a way of letting people know that you care, but you also want to see action at those levels. So I think a whole range of ways in which that support can be demonstrated. Yeah, look, there's many different layers to that question. I think the Royal Commission, you always feel like you could have done more, and there's certainly some things that I would like to have done, more in depth. We just didn't have the time, and the complexity of the issues was such that we just didn't have the time to do everything. We worked to the time that was given to us, and I think we did a reasonable job in terms of putting forward recommendations that, by and large, the Australian community supported, and we had bipartisan, political support. I think in terms of what's happening, I think there is, good things happening. It's good that so many of the recommendations were accepted and are being implemented, but we still need to see those changes. So yes, I'm happy that we got the response that we did and that we're seeing action. I do think, however, that we shouldn't be complacent. I do think that there is still, significant risks that this could fall off the priority list at the highest government levels and, with Defence and DVA. And I would just have to stress again the complexity of the changes. I mean, the words on the page might sound simple. But, for example, if I look at DVA and what's actually required within DVA as just one example, it's a fundamental change to the culture of DVA and them truly being there to achieve the best outcomes for veterans. Now, that's what they say now. They've said it for 100 years. That's not been the experience of veterans and their families. And I think DVA needs to appreciate what truly is required. That's a work in progress. I would say the same about defence and the cultural change that's required there. We heard from the service chiefs at the end of the Royal Commission, apologies for the harms that have occurred and a commitment to doing better. We need to actually see that change. So, and it's not a simple change. So, yes, I'm hopeful that the Royal Commission will achieve good things, but it's very much a work in progress. It will be for quite some time, and it needs that sustained effort and attention to ensure that it actually delivers.
So I think probably the call for action for those of us at home is really to find a community-led events, make your voice heard in terms of continuing to push for these changes and these reforms, in particular for our veterans. Find your local member, make sure that you annoy everybody as much as possible, and definitely look out for when that commission is released and how to continue to look at their outcomes and their findings and make sure that you're known there as well. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Peggy and Harry.